This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel dramatically tightens its lockdown as COVID cases soar once again. And trouble in the U.S. Capitol, the spiritual implications. Plus, tour Israel in non-COVID times. And a unique discovery from the time of Jesus in the Garden of Getsimani. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. For generations, people around the world have looked to the United States as the example of freedom and democracy. But the events in the U.S. Capitol this week have shaken Americans and others around the world. Here's a story from our Washington Bureau about what we know so far.
Demands for the president to resign have mounted even as a growing number of U.S. House Democrats, some 200 according to media accounts, say they'd impeach the president. One very notable call for his resignation came from a Wall Street Journal editorial. If Mr. Trump wants to avoid a second impeachment, his best path would be to take personal responsibility and resign. It adds this might also stem the flood of White House and cabinet resignations that are understandable as acts of conscience. And the number of those resignations has also been growing. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos and Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao have now stepped down in protest. They joined several others, including former acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. Now special envoy to Northern Ireland, he told CNBC, "I can't do it, I can't stay."
It's a small job, it's a part-time gig, but it's all I've got in the administration. I called Mike Pompeo last night, left him a note, told him that I'd be resigning from that. And I wouldn't be surprised to see more of my friends resign.
And the death toll from Wednesday's riots grew again when Capitol Hill police officer Brian Sicknick died Thursday night after being injured during confrontations with protesters. His death will be investigated as a homicide. Sicknick's death came as the fallout grows among Capitol Hill security officials from the violent takeover of the Capitol building by what some are calling domestic terrorists. The chief of the Capitol Police has agreed to resign before President-elect Joe Biden's January 20th inauguration. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms has stepped down, and Speaker Nancy Pelosi says the House Sergeant-at-Arms will also resign. Meanwhile, former Attorney General William Barr is blasting the president, telling the Associated Press Trump's conduct Wednesday was a betrayal of his office and supporters. Barr added, orchestrating a mob to pressure Congress is inexcusable. And some have taken another tactic, calling for top White House officials to use the 25th Amendment to oust Trump.
All indications are that the president has become unmoored, not just from his duty, nor even his oath, but from reality itself. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment allows a majority of the cabinet and the vice president to assume the duties of the office of presidency until the president is able to himself. It's time to invoke the 25th Amendment and to end this nightmare.
But that move's an unlikely long shot, with Vice President Mike Pence reportedly opposed. Amidst all this, President Trump put out a video Thursday night, finally calling for a smooth transition of power. He also condemned the protesters who took over the Capitol building.
Like all Americans, I am outraged by the violence, lawlessness, and mayhem. A new administration will be inaugurated on January 20th. My focus now turns to ensuring a smooth, orderly, and seamless transition of power. This moment calls for healing and reconciliation.
Despite the president's remarks, the political damage has been done. Now the question is, in elections in the years ahead, what impact will the Capitol chaos have on Trump and the Republicans? Paul Strand, CBN News, Washington.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemned the violence at the U.S. Capitol ahead of a meeting with U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin here in Jerusalem. He said American democracy has always inspired him, and he was sure it would prevail. He also thanked President Trump.
I want to thank President Trump and all of you in the administration for all you have done and are doing for peace. You've made a real difference, achieving one breakthrough after another, bringing the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan into the circle of peace. And I have no doubt that more Arab and Muslim countries will follow. I also want to commend the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. Under your leadership, the U.S. Treasury has played a crucial role in applying and enforcing sanctions on the Iranian regime.
Israel dramatically increased the restrictions on its third national lockdown with the goal of stopping the virus. These latest rules take effect as Israel already deals with its third national lockdown. It started just 12 days ago, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saw the need for greater restrictions.
Hospitals are warning us that we are entering the most dangerous wave since the outbreak of the plague. The Ministry of Health and the experts warn us that we are in a state of emergency and that if we do not act immediately, hundreds of Israelis will die and maybe even more.
This enhanced lockdown will continue for at least 2 more weeks and means closing all schools except special education, most businesses except necessities like grocery stores and pharmacies, and all workplaces except essential services. Each day, Israel is seeing about 8,000 new cases, and authorities blame this increase in part on the British mutation of COVID spreading in the country. Of the current 60,000 active cases, more than 800 people are in serious condition, and the death total stands at around 3,500. One group representing hundreds of Israeli doctors, professors, and scientists believes these new measures are counterproductive, urging the government to reconsider. Their statement reads, "This destructive third lockdown will cause severe damage to hundreds of thousands of households in Israel. It will lead to another rise in domestic violence, dropout of more students from the education system, delay further diagnoses of cancer, increase rates of depression and anxiety, increase the loneliness of the elderly, and many other heavy damages." They propose an approach that protects the vulnerable while reopening the economy to the less vulnerable. Meanwhile, authorities continue an aggressive push to vaccinate the population, leading to one of the fastest inoculation campaigns in the world. Israel now leads the world in per capita vaccinations.
We have here about 30 spots where nurses from our hospital are vaccinating the entire population, not only Tel Aviv, but we are doing that in a pace of around 5,000 to 7,000 a day here in this huge operation.
So far, more than 1.5 million Israelis have received the shot. The goal is to achieve herd immunity and become the first in the world to fully reopen its economy. The belief is that Israel can reach that goal after at least 5 million people have been either vaccinated or recover from a COVID infection. It's been 1 year since the killing of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps General Qasem Soleimani, and Iran's leaders are vowing revenge. This also comes as the country approaches a critical stage in enriching uranium. January 3rd, 2020. A drone over the skies of Baghdad kills the leader of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. As the anniversary neared, President Hassan Rouhani told his cabinet and the world the killing would not go without retaliation.
The martyrdom of our great general in a brutal assassination by American officials, mainly the President of the United States and his Secretary of State, these two are among the main culprits of this crime. Of course, others had a role too, and our nation will not leave them alone.
Other Iranian officials at a ceremony for Soleimani pointed specifically at U.S. troops in the region.
Today, we have no problem, concern, or apprehension in encountering any powers. We will give our final words to our enemies in the battlefield.
Over the weekend, Israel delivered the U.S. Army a second Iron Dome anti-missile battery. In a show of force, American B-52 bombers flew over the Persian Gulf to deter any potential attacks. And the Times of Israel is reporting the IDF is preparing for any potential strike by Iranian-backed militias in Yemen or Iraq. On the nuclear front, Iran also informed the UN it would begin enriching uranium to 20% at its Fordo facility. That puts Iran one step away from creating weapons-grade uranium.
We're like soldiers and our fingers are on the triggers. The commander should command and we shoot. We're ready for this and will produce enriched uranium as soon as possible.
A decade ago, Iran's decision to pursue that percentage of enrichment nearly provoked an Israeli strike on its nuclear facilities. Coming up, a somber Christmas in Armenia after a brutal war. In October, fighting broke out between two former Soviet countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan. The short war resulted in more than 5,000 dead and 100,000 displaced. As Chuck Holton reports, a ceasefire ended the fighting in November, but Armenia has been racked by ongoing strife since then.
Winter in Armenia. The cold weather might be brutal, but the citizens of this historically Christian nation make it through by drawing on warm traditions of faith and family.
Celebrating Christmas on December 25th started back in 336 AD when Emperor Constantine of the Holy Roman Empire declared that day to be the day Jesus' birth would be celebrated. But here in Armenia, they were celebrating Jesus' birth on January 6th, more than 3 decades earlier. That's the day we now call the Epiphany in the United States. And they still do it that way here today, more than 1,600 years later.
We celebrate Christmas on the eve of Christmas is the night of the January 5th. And that's when we celebrate the candlelight liturgy and we announce the birth of the Christ. And the next day in the morning, January 6th, again, we have liturgies at the churches all over the world.
More than 95% of Armenians claim Christianity, and so religious holidays like this one are very important here, following traditions passed down by the Armenian Apostolic Church for millennia.
This is the Hagar-Sin monastery in the northern part of Armenia in a town called Dilijan. And Christians have been celebrating Christ's birth at this spot in that church behind me for over 1,000 years. This year's celebration is a little subdued, and there's a reason for that. We talked to one of the priests here to find out why.
It's about our existence, our identity, our everything.
He's not talking about the Armenian church, though that is central to life here in Armenia. He's talking about their homeland, part of which was just lost in a short but intense conflict with their eastern neighbor, Azerbaijan. Starting in September 2020, the Azeri army moved in to take over lands where Armenians have lived for thousands of years, and the loss is deeply felt among the people here.
It's traumatic, let's say, and we still need time to truly analyze and understand the whole what happened to us and why it happened, and make a kind of strong commitment for revival.
This year, Armenia is not really celebrating the special holidays, the New Year's and Christmas in a festive way because, as you know, Armenia was hit by a devastating war in 2020, which left us with heavy losses. We lost thousands of young lives. We lost our historic lands.
Normally, the capital city of Yerevan is heavily decorated with lights for the Christmas season. But this year, between the COVID virus and the war, the mood is subdued. Nevertheless, these worshipers are putting their faith in God for the future.
This is a moment of mourning, this is a moment of reflection, and this is a moment of also appreciating what we have. Also, this birth of Christ is allowing us to think about the rebirth of our nation and of our dreams, and hopefully being able to stand up again and protect our land.
From Armenia, Merry Christmas. I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Up next, tired of coronavirus? A look at a tour to the Holy Land in non-COVID times. "2020 was set to be another record-breaking year for tourism in Israel. But sadly, COVID closed the skies and borders to tourists. Now, looking ahead, we want to give you a glimpse of what a tour of Israel looks like in non-COVID times.
This is the scene outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It's just one example of the many Christians making their way to the Holy Land this year. CBN News followed one church group on their pilgrimage. Many Christians begin their journey not in Jerusalem, but up in the Galilee, where Jesus began his earthly ministry. That includes this group from Virginia's New Life Providence Church.
Who knows, Jesus might have been stilling the storm right in this very spot. It certainly wouldn't be unlikely.
Pastor Dan Backens says coming to Israel means a lot.
As a pastor, what I enjoy about coming to Israel is first of all to see the excitement in the parishioners that come with me or the guests that can come along in our tour group, to see the Bible come alive for them and what God does in their own heart through their trip here to Israel.
Debbie Carter waited 38 years for her chance.
I have cried and wept and leapt for joy the whole time I've been here, seeing the many spots where my Lord walked.
Many others feel the same.
It's a life-changing experience, a life-changing experience. I would not have missed it for the world.
Like most Christians touring the Galilee, they also visited Capernaum, home of the Apostle Peter, and the Mount of Beatitudes, where Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. After the Galilee, many tours head south to visit the Dead Sea and Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. But for most, the highlight is Jerusalem, where Jesus died, was buried, and rose again. Here the group is on the Mount of Olives overlooking the city. The most meaningful thing for many Christians is the opportunity to walk where Jesus walked. For example, this is the path many believe Jesus took from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem. One of those places is the Garden of Gethsemane. The Gospels record this is the place where Jesus prayed the night before he was crucified and said to his Father, "Not my will, but yours be done." For some, it brought home the lesson of the agony of Jesus in the garden.
I don't ever have to be in the Garden of Gethsemane pleading before the Father, because Jesus did it already.
They also walked along the Via Dolorosa, the traditional site where Jesus carried his cross on the way to Calvary, and also sang in St. Anne's Church with its world-famous acoustics. Their tour guide, Erez Bar David, has led thousands of Christians throughout the land of the Bible.
People go through a very, very deep experience, spiritual and emotional experience when they're here. I think it's just this deeper understanding of Scripture.
When you read the Scriptures, you're kind of looking at it in black and white, but when you come here, it just really jumps off the page. It makes the Bible jump off the page, and you're able to see really in color, wow, like this is real. This is really what our faith is built upon.
But is it safe? Many people don't visit Israel because they're afraid.
If I could dispel any kinds of fear about someone traveling to Israel, the media sometimes portrays the threat of terrorism and unrest. Israel is probably the safest tourist destination that there is, because everyone here, Arab, Palestinian, Israeli, Jew, non-Jew, they want tourism.
Israel's tourism minister sees evangelical Christians as much more than just tourists.
You are not the guests, you are partners. It's also, the Holy Land also belongs to you.
Christian pilgrims say there are many reasons to visit Israel, from the personal to the prophetic.
It's a real tangible way that we as Christians in the United States can support Israel in this very important time, not only prophetically, but in their national history, what they're going through too.
It's become an amazing personal experience for me, one that I'll never forget, and it's almost too much to put into words.
And for many, it's like coming home. Still ahead, a first-of-its-kind discovery dating to the time of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. For the first time, archaeologists here in Jerusalem have discovered evidence from Second Temple times near the church in the Garden of Gethsemane, linking the place to the time of Jesus. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Saul tells us how a current building project led to the ancient find.
The Garden of Gethsemane, marked by the Church of All Nations, has been revered for generations as the place where Jesus prayed on the night he was betrayed before his crucifixion.
The church behind me was built at the foot of the Mount of Olives between 1919 and 1924. When the foundations were laid, remains of the Byzantine and Crusader periods were discovered, but nothing from the Second Temple times when Jesus would have been there.
2,000 years ago, it was a field outside the walls of Jerusalem, full with olive trees,
and in the middle of the field was some kind of olive press for making oil.
The name Gethsemane comes from the Hebrew Gat Shemanim, or oil press in English. Millions of pilgrims visit the site each year, which is across the valley from the old city walls and Temple Mount. Recently, the custodians of the site began building a visitors center and tunnel, linking the church grounds with the Kidron Valley across the street. When they discovered ancient ruins, the Israel Antiquities Authority stepped in to excavate and discovered a much older site.
Suddenly, in the middle of this underground passage, the mountain collapsed and revealed ancient and amazing find, the Jewish ritual bath known by the name the mikveh.
Archaeologist Amit Raem explains the connection to the olives.
According to the Jewish law, when you are doing olive oil, you need to be purified. For the first time, we have archaeological evidence that something was here in the Second Temple period, the days of Jesus.
The findings are set to be incorporated into the new visitors center.
Up till today, pilgrims like to come to this place in thousands every day. We hope to preserve the element. We are excited to be able here in Getsemani to find something which belonged to the time of Jesus.
Archaeologists also uncovered the remains of a 1,500-year-old church in the Kidron Valley. Later, a large hospice or monastery was built on the site, but it was destroyed in the 12th century, probably as a result of Salah ad-Din's Muslim conquest of the city. Raem says the Gethsemane excavation is an example of Jerusalem's archaeology at its best, combining traditions and beliefs with historical evidence. Julie Stahl, CBN News, at the foot of the Mount of Olives, Jerusalem.
Well, that's one example of the remarkable archaeological finds here in Jerusalem. Because of the situation going on in the United States, please pray for America at this critical time in its history. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.
Alpha, Omega.